For my final major project, I have decided to research architecture, with the environment as my sub-theme. The reason behind my choices is because I will be attending an architecture course at the University of the West in Bristol in 2025, and I chose to take this project as an opportunity to do some basic research on a certain architectural style. Specifically, I chose Victorian architecture. Not only is it common in the UK, it's also a name for a variety of other styles, such as Gothic Revival, Queen Anne, and the Second Empire. Not only that, I also chose this specific architectural style as it is my favourite. For my brainstorm, I went ahead and classified the main aspects of my project: disciplines, themes, artists, media materials, and keywords. I filled out this brainstorm as much as I could, all whilst maintaining a high-quality sketchbook. I began my research by dedicating a page for the question, what is Victorian architecture? I went ahead and answered the question with a variety of facts, ranging from the specific dates in which this architectural style was introduced to the unique exterior characteristics. Now that I have clarified what my final major project theme is, I started going into specifics, materials used in Victorian architecture. I split each material off into different groups: wood, brick, metals, concrete, and then other aspects such as timber framing and glass. Next up, I researched characteristics. I split the double page into two, one side dedicated to the interior and the other dedicated to exterior. Researching this has made me realise how much architecture has changed over the decades. Most housing has gone from colourful, geometric, tiled flooring to a simple, minimalistic marble or carpeted floor. Although some housing does maintain some of its originality. For example, my grandparents' house has a more modernised kitchen, but still has the original tiling in the hallway. I felt it'd only be right to compare Victorian architecture to modern architecture to show the significant changes of trends in the architectural industry. Once again splitting the double page into two, I began writing about Victorian architecture, when it was founded, specific details such as floors, colours used, and the maximalist style it maintained. I then indulged in comparing my theme to modern architecture. This research task I saw myself is quite interesting, as the two styles are completely different to one another. Victorian architecture, as stated before, is a more maximalist approach, whereas the modern architecture is more minimalistic. Now that I have researched my main theme, I decided to research about my sub-theme, the environment. I chose to include the environment in my project as the environment plays a big part in the designs of most architectural buildings. I included images I had captured myself to make this more personal, and I went into detail about certain biomes and their differences. I also added some interesting facts about the UK's natural landscapes and observational drawings of flowers. To relate this research to architecture, I also mentioned the vines that occasionally grow up buildings' walls. In the long run, this research allowed me to gain an understanding of the UK's naturalistic landscape and how I could portray it in my final piece. Now that the theme research stage is complete, I started researching my 10 inspirational artists. I researched 5 artists that have work about nature and 5 architects that have designed Victorian architecture. For my artists, I included historical figures such as Mary Moser and Alexander Marshall. I chose more historical artists as I love the way they paint compared to more abstract modern art. As someone who focuses on realism, it was only right I researched artists that worked in the same or similar way. Architecture-wise, I included architects such as Alfred Waterhouse and Thomas Cubitt. After completing all my artist research, I decided what experiments I wanted to do. I chose flower pressing, crafting foam, air-dry clay, origami and acrylic paint. Flower pressing, despite the lengthy time I waited for the daisies' outcomes, came out better than I was expecting, despite not having the proper flower pressing kit. Not only did the flowers keep their shape, they also kept their vibrant colours. I experimented with crafting foam by trying out different shaped tools to carve into it. I carved a brickwork pattern into the surface, which had a better outcome than I was expecting, although it did take some time to cut out a piece of foam that would fit into my sketchbook. My air-dry clay experiment was definitely my least favourite experiment. Despite using the material before, the outcome I was hoping for was quite difficult with how delicate the clay was. The origami experiment was one of my favourites. This task allowed me to create some pretty, minimalistic tulips that I have stuck onto the page as evidence. Acrylic paint was also an interesting experiment. I focused on trying to make small acrylic paint flowers, which had a better outcome than I was expecting yet again, and they dried quite quickly, so I stuck them in my book. I kept my primary research stage quite short but detailed for the sake of having time to do my final design and complete my final piece early. I split this page into two again: architectural research and environmental research. My architectural research consisted of photographing the Victorian architecture in my town, whereas my environmental research consists of visiting a public garden to photograph as many flowers as I could. I also did some observational drawings for each section of my primary research using a pencil, a black fine liner, white gel pen with some watercolour paints. Throughout this, I had the most fun with the environmental research, as it was a vibrant, detailed page I had the joys of decorating. For my final ideas, I did 3. For each one, I did a mind map, a meaning, a description, a colour palette, and some simple drawings of the design with a photo references I captured myself, alongside a list of any materials I would need to purchase. My first design is a box frame that contains tulips against a white brick background. Although my main theme is architecture, I wanted to portray the strong meaning of how the environment should be always prioritised first, hence why I've made the tulips overgrown and coming out the frame. My second design, once again, focuses more on the environmental side, showing viewers that no matter how hard you try, nature will always find a way to adapt. And then my third and final idea is more of another design idea for idea 2, as it holds the same meaning but shows more architectural aspects with the inclusion of a Victorian house. After determining the advantages and disadvantages of each design, I decided to go with design 1. This is because I like the meaning behind it and the variety of materials I'd planned to use. Before beginning the production of my final piece, I wrote about the health and safety and the materials and tools I would need. I felt this was important due to some of the materials and tools I would be using. For instance, I used Gorilla Glue to put my piece together. The fumes and getting the glue on your skin could make one irritable. Not only that, using a scalpel would cause injuries if used wrong. I took all these things into consideration and wrote about how I'd avoid any of these problems. Finally, it was time for me to begin my final piece. I began making the back wall using crafting foam as a base, and I used air-dry clay to add some asymmetrical details, including a small amount of brickwork that I intended to make look as if it had been painted over. But after letting the clay dry, it cracked and I decided to peel it all off. Some of the thinner layers of clay remained and made a realistic depth to the wall once painted over with white acrylic. Whilst letting the paint dry, I used a mixture of sugar and white paint to make the brick texture to apply to the foam. This took multiple layers, but I am happy with the result. And for extra details, I used chalk and a makeup brush to add shading and painted over some stains on the wall to further the realistic piece I am working towards. Whilst the back wall dried, I began using polymer clay and to try and make the tulips, but unfortunately the result wasn't what I wanted, so I attempted to use paper mache instead. Yet again, this didn't give me the result of realism I was looking for. After speaking with my teacher, I decided to attempt to use origami paper, tissue and watercolour since I was close to the deadline. The leaves had a decent outcome, the colours were similar to that of a real tulip, and the paper coloured around the frame well. With regards to the flowers, the colours I'm happy with, but if I had more time, I would have added more detail. Overall, I am quite pleased with this outcome, despite the issues I faced during the production. From my point of view, this project was a big challenge for me, as I am more comfortable with working with two-dimensional materials and techniques. In a way, this final major project was more of a trial and error for me more than anything else.